Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Graeme Smith about his new book, The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an assistant adjunct professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and program officer at the Balsley School of International Affairs. Every week we welcome an expert in global governance or international public policy to the show, to the studio here at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Today we welcome Graeme Smith, a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group, who's here to discuss his new book, The Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
You covered the war in Afghanistan for the Globe and Mail for 6 years, from 2005 to 2011, spending most of your time in Southern Afghanistan. The very first sentence of your book is, "We lost the war in Southern Afghanistan and it broke my heart." How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, my heart felt broken, so that part was easy to arrive at. But, you know, this was a war for peace and stability in many ways. And the reality is that we brought neither to Afghanistan. The number of people being killed on a daily basis now, today in Afghanistan, is much higher than it was when we first went in. So just by the numbers, things have gotten a lot messier. You know, it was easy in those initial years to get drawn into this idea that we could bring the whole basket of civilization to Southern Afghanistan. You know, democracy, rule of law, all these good things. And you know, Afghanistan desperately needs these things, but I think our way of delivering these goods proved to be terribly flawed.
I wonder if you could expand on that. You write in the book that initially you were quite optimistic that this could be a success story in nation building. And why were you caught up in the optimism, and why ultimately was that such flawed thinking in hindsight?
I was a 26-year-old newspaper reporter. I was young and excited. You know, fairly early on, I think it was a soldier who told me that once upon a time, cartographers drew their maps with dragons at the edge of the world and just wrote, you know, "There be dragons," or "There be basilisks," or whatever. Right. This idea that, you know, at the edge of the known world, at the edge of civilization, there's just wildness. And he said that now civilization can't accept these ragged edges, you know, that the dragons fly out of those blank spaces and they bite you in the ass. And you know, this was an image that really caught my imagination. You know, it felt like September the 11th was maybe an example of the dragons literally flying out of the Badlands and biting you in the ass. And so you had to mend the fabric of civilization in some ways. You had to bring some basic modicum of rule of law, of democracy to these areas where there hadn't been that. And it was a very alluring idea. It really drew me in. And for a couple of years at first, when I first arrived, you know, 2005, 2006, I think I believed that this was what was happening and this was what was possible. And it took a little while to be disillusioned. You know, I was bombed, shot at, rocketed, mortared, RPG'd, rocked by a suicide bomber. I would finish days of reporting with the little bits of gristle of, you know, charred human flesh from suicide bombings stuck in the treads of my shoes. And so it took a lot of those sort of exhausting days, frustrating days of seeing the practical results of our work in Afghanistan before I think I finally was disillusioned about that, those sort of initial hopes.
Right. Was there a particular turning point in your coverage of the war when you started to feel like we'd lost our way a bit?
I mean, it was probably when I started to realize who exactly it was we were fighting. I was privileged to follow Canadian soldiers as they bravely charged into the river valley southwest of Kandahar City during Operation Medusa in September 2006. You know, the Canadians, from a military perspective, performed very well, you know, in those weeks. And it was an amazing time to see the whole might of NATO firepower on display, 2,000-pound bombs dropping, and the Canadian howitzers firing so often that they ran out of rounds. It was an amazing military feat that we accomplished there. But then when I started to look into why the battle was necessary in the first place, who it was precisely that we were fighting, the most senior UN official in the South at the time, a guy named Talibek Masadikov, who spoke the local language and understood the South very, very well, he said to me, look, half of those guys you're fighting at least, were just angry locals. They were just local farmers who were rising up. And that ran against the whole narrative that we constructed about sort of Al-Qaeda, Taliban, bad guys infiltrating from Pakistan. And obviously bad people were slipping over the border from Pakistan. But there was a huge sort of local element to what was going on that really started to make me think about why it was that ordinary people would rebel against what should have been a fairly benign government. We were building girls' schools, we were building roads. Why would they rebel? And so that was the question, I think, at the heart of why I started to become disillusioned.
We'll be back in a moment with Graeme Smith. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Graeme, in the book, you are quite critical of NATO's military tactics, particularly the issue of troop surges to defeat the Taliban. At one point, you even argue that the surges will be remembered as a spectacular mistake. Why do you argue that these, which happened on multiple occasions, were so deeply flawed?
When I wrote that, I first submitted this manuscript maybe 2 years ago. That was fairly controversial, but I think now it's become almost common wisdom. It was only recently that General Eikenberry, who has commanded U.S. troops in Afghanistan and also served as a U.S. ambassador there, published a piece saying that the whole counterinsurgency theory was off. And a lot of other people now are coming out. And it's an interesting time, actually, where we're just reaching the tipping point, I think, of NATO starting to do some self-reflection, starting to ruminate on this idea of failure. And I think it's very useful because you cannot get your head around what happened in Afghanistan if you're unwilling to admit failure. It can be very healthy, I think. Right. Some things are very easy to measure. If you were trying to send huge numbers of troops down there into southern Afghanistan to stabilize the area, to bring peace, that's the primary mission, that didn't happen. Today, the South is an inferno. Violence is up 50% year on year nationwide. It's pretty bad in the South. I haven't seen the numbers recently for Kandahar, but it's up in the districts. In Kandahar city proper, within the downtown areas, there's some peace. Now, peace still means that there are car bombs and assassinations, but the level of violence has surprisingly tailed off a little bit in the downtown areas. So you can't say it's uniformly a disaster, but I think if you look generally at the situation, what we're leaving behind is a war, a very serious war, a very nasty war, a war that seems likely to escalate. A lot of people are predicting that after we completely pull out by the end of 2014, leaving behind probably only a relatively small stay-behind force, that the war is going to keep getting nastier. That's right, and the surges have in a sense, created the conditions for this. Yeah, I mean, the metaphor that the generals always used was, we're going to kick the hornet's nest, and that it's an unpleasant process. When you kick the hornet's nest, you get stung, but ultimately the hornet's nest needs to be removed. And I actually asked a general one time, sir, why would you do that? Like, is there any time in real life when you would ever kick a hornet's nest? And he sort of laughed, but the reality is that, there's a bunch of angry hornets swarming around southern Afghanistan now.
Right.
And it's hard to put them back in the bottle.
Shifting gears slightly,
Yeah.
you're also very critical of the poppy eradication programs. Why is this the case?
I mean, the whole idea of radically changing Afghanistan's economy at the same time as you're fighting a counterinsurgency, I think the problem was that we were fighting too many wars at the same time. You're fighting this war on drugs at the same time as you're fighting a counterinsurgency, at the same time as you're fighting a war on terrorism.
Right.
And those are very distinct campaigns. Obviously, at some point, Afghanistan needs a real economy. You can't just keep selling illegal drugs forever. But right now, the practical effect of burning and razing farmers' fields is that those farmers have already been paid by the drug dealers for their crop. They get cash advances for their crop. And so if you lose money and you're in debt to a drug dealer, you have to do desperate things. You have to, for example, send a son to go fight with the Taliban. You have to sell a daughter because you can pay say about a $5,000 bride price for a little girl. So you can get out of debt by selling your daughter to some nasty old man. These are just very sad stories that result from our actions, and they make ordinary people very, very angry.
Right.
And when we surveyed the Taliban, we sent little video recorders out in the districts. We interviewed 42 Talibs. A huge percentage of them said that they had personally experienced, or their family had personally experienced, poppy eradication, which is astonishing because poppy eradication actually isn't that common. It was a very small number of hectares that are getting razed. And so it meant that there is probably some kind of correlation between destroying the poppy fields and people getting angry and fighting.
Right. And so I guess in a way, this was the equivalent economically to the military surges. I mean, is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there was a huge counterinsurgency effort at the same time as a huge counter-narcotics effort. And they both proved quixotic. In the book, I talk about how we weren't upfront with the people of Afghanistan about what we were doing. The British, especially when they went into Helmand, simply said, "We are not here to destroy your poppy fields." They would say this. They would sit down with tribal elders and say to them face to face and say, "We have nothing to do with that poppy eradication strategy." At the same time as the British government was funding the poppy eradication, they were hiring the people that were going in and destroying the fields. But it was all part of this. They assumed basically that the local people were stupid, and they may have been backwards. They may have been living in medieval conditions. Right. But they were not stupid. They understood that as soon as the government captured an area, the poppy eradicators came in and burned the fields. Right. I think in many ways we underestimated the people of Afghanistan.
Right. Thank you. We'll be back in a moment with Graeme Smith. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Graeme, throughout the book you talk about a number of violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law that were committed by NATO forces, and as well as the Afghan authorities. And in your opinion, what has been the price that has been paid by not adhering to these standards in international law?
Look, I mean, the center of gravity of any counterinsurgency is the goodwill and the opinions of the local people. It's what the military calls hearts and minds.
Right.
And you can't win that kind of war if you're torturing people, if you are bombing villages flat. I mean, for a while there, according to the UN, we were about 50-50. About half of the civilians killed in the conflict were killed by pro-government forces, including NATO, including Afghan forces, and about half of them were being killed by the Taliban. And when it reached that point, I think the internationals realized that this was a serious problem, and they started to change their policies. They scaled back their close air support, so it became a little bit less likely that they'd be bombing villagers. They changed some of their ways of fighting the war. It helped a little bit. Right now, according to the UN, the Taliban is actually inflicting a lot more damage on ordinary civilians than NATO or the Afghans. But the point is that these are not morally equivalent forces, because
right.
we're not giving the Taliban money and guns and paying their salaries to fight. The fact is that if we are supposedly the good guys, we have to behave like good guys. And it's the only way as well to persuade the ordinary villagers that they should support the government rather than the Taliban. And so I got really interested in this question of torture, especially. We went into jails and interviewed ordinary detainees. Torture, unfortunately, is rife in Afghan prisons still to this day. Right. And I think it's something that really, it's not only wrong, but I think it doesn't help the Afghans win the war.
Right. You also note that there are many in Afghanistan who would put forward the counter argument that this is a brutal theater of war and international law is really of very little relevance in this kind of context. I could see why that's a very seductive line of reasoning. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there are a lot of people who like to, repeat this idea that the Iron Emir was the only guy who ever truly controlled Afghanistan, and he built pyramids with the skulls of his enemies. And even sometimes ordinary Afghans will tell you that, you can only really tell that someone's serious if they do these really nasty things. It's tough. It's tough. I think at the end of the day, NATO forces should follow the laws. If you capture someone, you should not be handing them over to torture chambers. It's against the law.
Right.
If we are going to be giving money to Afghan forces and to fight the Taliban, we need to know that they are better than the Taliban. That's why we give them money, so that they can push away the bad guys, not that so that they can become the bad guys. And that is something that Afghanistan is really going to struggle with. Right now, there are, officially something like 19,000 Afghan local police. These are sort of hastily raised militia forces. They get like a couple of weeks of training. They get a gun. They get a white pickup truck. They go back to their districts to enforce order. There will be serious questions as that force grows, and they're supposed to grow to something like 45,000, about whether or not those guys are going to be a source of order or a source of disorder. And something that we can do, I mean, even though we're drawing down our forces, something that we can do is make sure that the money that we, the international community, Canada and all the rest, spend in Afghanistan, we have to make sure that money is being used to hold these people to account, to make sure that that they know that if we catch them, on YouTube doing some kind of atrocity or something, that is game over. That we will not support that kind of behavior.
Right. And is that a conversation that we in the West are ready to have, though? Given that, as you know, we are pulling out that, we know that torture is rampant. Is there a political will to follow through on what you've just advocated?
Yeah, I worry that Afghanistan as a whole topic is just falling right off the map. People are tired. All of the various authorities in the Western capitals are distracted with Syria and other things. And they're out of money, You have to remember that this whole effort in Afghanistan started at the end of a decade where America had enjoyed unprecedented prosperity.
Right.
And now we're wrapping up the war at a period when the entire Western world is a bit hard up for cash. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, just finding the attention, finding the funding for continued engagement of some kind is a real uphill fight in these Western capitals.
Right. Well, thank you very much. We will be back in a moment with Graeme Smith. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back. Graeme, you conclude the book by arguing that, and I'll quote you, "We failed to understand the needs and desires of the local people, and that at best we are leaving behind an ongoing war and at worst a looming disaster." That's pretty heavy. If you had to guess, what is the legacy of the conflict in Southern Afghanistan that we've left behind?
I mean, it's a good section to highlight because the needs and desires of the Afghan people were never really well understood. We started this war, obviously, without consulting people in Afghanistan. And even our methods of getting feedback from ordinary people in Afghanistan as we went forward with the counterinsurgency were deeply flawed. These opinion polls in Afghanistan are not a useful way of figuring out what ordinary people think. And so we're flying blind, you know, we're basically taking pretty broad guesses about what we think the people might appreciate. And I think a lot of the times we're way off. And so, you know, it creates a very sort of sad situation where ordinary Afghans are bewildered about why we came in the first place, and they're bewildered about our departure. And they make up all kinds of absurd conspiracy stories about, you know, what it was that we were trying to achieve in the first place. Right. They will never understand us, probably, and we may never understand them. What we leave behind, I was just back in Kandahar recently. I went back and saw some old friends this summer. It actually wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. Right down in Kandahar city, in the heart of the city, the downtown neighborhoods, there is greater security today than there was, say, 2 years ago. This is a result of a massive buildup of Afghan forces. If you drive across the Barrypole Bridge from Jari district into the city, this sort of buffer between the city and the Taliban-infested districts west of the city, there are easily a dozen checkpoints, probably more. I was hauled out of the car and searched. You know, my body was searched, my car was searched. They pull up the mat in the trunk of the car, and they do this several times on your way into town. It looks almost like a science fiction movie. This array of Afghan forces with their guns pointed west at the edge of town. They are ready for a very serious fight after we leave. Right. And you know, I think they're going to have it out. I don't think the Taliban are going to back down anytime in the next couple of years. I think the government forces are ready for a fight. Some people were worried that the Afghan forces would simply give up. I do not think they're going to give up. I think we're leaving behind a conflict. One heck of a war is going to continue after we go.
Right. Do you get a sense that we in the West and specifically the NATO countries have learned anything from this experience?
I think we've only so far drawn the crudest possible lessons from Afghanistan, which is be careful of getting into a ground war in a Muslim country, which is too bad, really, because if we're going to continue trying to go in with our military forces, arguably the most powerful military forces that ever existed in the history of humanity, and do something useful in countries that are deeply screwed up, we have to be a little more nuanced in the lessons that we draw from these debacles like we had in Southern Afghanistan. You know, I was standing in Benghazi in Libya when Gaddafi's tanks were rolling towards us, and I was so grateful when I heard that French jets were deployed. You know, I'm not against intervention as a principle, but you know, clearly we need to look a little more carefully at the war in Afghanistan. And that starts with that simple admission that we screwed up, and what can we do better next time?
Right. Was there, do you think, looking back, a sense of hubris that clouded judgment?
Without a doubt, yeah.
And a sense that we went in with answers when perhaps we should have been asking questions?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. That sense of humility, I think, is key. You have to remember that when the British were trying to control bits of South Asia, they had people who lived there full time and learned multiple local languages and spent their lives, getting to know the local politics and trying to influence them. And now we have 6-month rotations of troops that land, make decisions about what should happen and try to implement them before they fly back home. And that's no way to fight a war, not the kind of subtle political wars that we're trying to fight.
If there's one thing you want your readers to take away from your book, what might that be?
I make a plea at the end of the book simply to not forget about Afghanistan. These days, when I tell people I'm launching a book about Afghanistan, they kind of look at me like, "You're launching a book about Afghanistan, not Syria or something?" And it's true. Afghanistan's just fallen off the radar. There was a military guy from the Canadian Forces who was writing I think it was a blog about Canada's continued operations in Afghanistan, and if the lead sentence was something along the lines of, "We're still here. You may have forgotten about us, but we still have troops deployed in Afghanistan." I really hope that the Canadians, even after the troops pull out in March, that they won't forget, and that they will encourage their government to keep engaging, because we have to do something to repair the damage that we've done.
Right. Graeme, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Graeme Smith's book, Dogs Are Eating Them Now, Our War in Afghanistan, is available in bookstores. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, our audience, for joining us. You've been listening or watching to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.